Welcome to the Be Better podcast, presented by CSO Broker, the show where we will speak to innovators in sustainability, so through collaboration, we can build a better world. Solutions today for a better tomorrow. Welcome back, listener. On today's episode, we will explore the built environment by speaking with Kate Chilton, Chief Sustainability Officer at BamCore, a startup revolutionizing what we use and how we stand up our buildings by using bamboo and eucalyptus in place of traditional wood framing. Here's our conversation. Kate, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the Be Better podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Of course. You know, when I think about climate change, I think when we all think about climate change and what has impacted it the most, we think oil and gas, right? We think electricity. We don't really think about the buildings that we live in, right? We don't think about the built environment too much. Could you do us all a favor and just try to sum up the built environment's role in climate change?
Yes, I think I have some pretty astounding data points that do a good job of painting the picture. So the built sector is responsible for roughly 40% of all greenhouse gases globally.
Right.
It generates 40% of all waste. It uses 40% of all extracted resources. And it's responsible for 30% of biodiversity loss. It's also the primary end use for the highest impact materials. So this is cement, iron, steel, and aluminum. So it's massive. And at the same time, global building floor area is expected to double by 20. So the problem's really clear. If we don't change the way we build, we cannot avoid the worst impacts of climate change.
Right. And some of the ways that we're kind of looking to, kind of re-engineer the infrastructure that has propped up our world, right, is looking at the materials that stand our buildings up, right? Because we don't really think about all of the activities that go into mining all of that material, the embodied carbon of the material itself, when we're building a house for people to live in. Can you talk a little bit about the way BamCore is addressing the built environment's impact to climate change today?
Absolutely. You actually mentioned embodied carbon, and I think it's probably worth taking a second to explain a little bit further what that is as it relates to the built environment. When you talk about buildings, there's the embodied carbon and there's the operating carbon. And I think most people, when they think about buildings, they think about this operating carbon piece. This is really the energy consumption that is associated with using buildings. But operating carbon or embodied carbon or embodied emissions are associated with every single other life cycle stage of buildings. So the extraction of the raw materials, manufacturing, transportation to the construction site, and then construction itself, that's all the upfront carbon. And then there's the refurbishment that happens throughout a building's life cycle, and then finally disposal at the end. So all of that is embodied carbon. It's a huge piece of a building's entire life cycle. And to understand why embodied carbon is so important, you really need to think about the time value of carbon. And so This is similar to time value of money and finance. It's basically the concept that greenhouse gas emissions cut today are worth more than cuts promised in the future. And so this really highlights the need to prioritize what's happening in the near term while we still have a fighting chance to avoid things like tipping points, which, if crossed, will cause irreversible changes in our climate system. And so to bring it to BAMCOR, our mission is to decarbonize the built environment, and we're doing this in two key ways: by changing the materials and the methods of framing. And so to address your initial question, embodied carbon, we are using nature's fastest and strongest structural fibers.
So when we think about the carbon emissions associated with standing up a building, the embodied carbon of a particular product, right? It often takes form in doing the analysis to figure out what that is in the form of an LCA. And it sounds like BAMCOR has a product that significantly reduces the carbon emissions associated with a particular product in support of that LCA. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct that LCAs are key ways that you assess the impact of any product, building or not, and they result in EPDs, environmental product declarations, and traditionally these life cycle assessment frameworks are what we call static. So they're very much point in time, and they do not take into account all of the benefits and realities really associated with using fast growing fibers. They treat a bamboo culm that can regenerate within a year exactly the same as a Douglas fir that takes 40 years to regenerate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so one of the key things that BAMCOR is trying to promote is the use of dynamic LCAs. So dynamic LCAs really incorporate the timing of when emissions happen and when they can be resequestered. And so I am actually joining Smart EPD's committee. They are developing a new product category rule for annually renewable fibers. And so this is one of the ways that we're really going to be trying to push for incorporating the benefits associated with using fast-growing fibers.
Yeah, it seems like a really important perspective, honestly, to include into that assessment.
Yeah, we're very data-driven here at BAMCOR, and it feels like a big miss to not kind of incorporate that timing component. It's one of the reasons why GWP is sort of the standard. GWP 100, I should say, is really the standard for assessing the effects of greenhouse gases. But that's 100 years in the future. We don't know what the world's going to look like. We need to be enabled to make decisions in a more near-term way. And so that's why these dynamic assessments we think are better decision-making tools.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you guys are leveraging fast fibers, right? So what exactly does that mean from like an end user perspective? And how does that help to, kind of reduce the embodied carbon?
So I think it's important for people to know that simply using bio-based materials doesn't inherently mean they are carbon neutral. They're certainly better than some of those high impact materials, but there are emissions associated with harvesting and processing the fibers. And so the key benefit of bio-based construction is not taking the carbon from one system, i.e. the forest, and putting it in another, the building. Really, the benefit comes from the plant that regrows and replaces the harvested one and sequesters additional carbon.
Gotcha.
And so that's why the fast growth really matters, because the faster that the regrowth happens, the sooner it can compensate for the emissions that were associated with harvesting and manufacturing it, and the sooner that climate cooling benefits can come into effect because we're removing additional carbon after the fact. So that's the main reason we work with bamboo and eucalyptus, the two fast-growing fibers we work with.
Yeah. When I think about bamboo and eucalyptus, two extremely invasive species, right? I've seen a few bamboo forests, even here in North America. I'm not sure if you can call them forests, but it's an extremely invasive species. I guess what are some of the co-benefits associated with harvesting bamboo?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it hits on one of the biggest misconceptions about bamboo,
Yeah.
because there's two large categories. There's the invasive kind. We like to call them runners because their root system is extremely extensive. It can go, hundreds of feet in any direction, and it can cause a lot of damage when it's not properly managed. There's another kind of bamboo called clumping bamboo, and that's the kind that we like to work with. And the bamboo in these cases basically grow in little clumps. And the benefit of working with that kind of bamboo is that once a clump is mature, which usually takes 5 to 7 years, you can selectively harvest individual culms about a fifth every year. And when that culm is removed within just one growing season, the clump will push up a whole new culm of the exact same size. So that really gets to that impressive speed of growth. And then the other added benefit of this selective harvesting approach is that we're not clear cutting. So that's one of the biggest reasons why bamboo is so powerful, is because of this harvesting method. When you don't clear cut, you're avoiding a huge emissions event that occurs with the destruction of the
Right.
soil and the ecosystem. So by keeping it intact, you're helping to maintain the soil. You're also promoting biodiversity because you're not ripping out an entire ecosystem. It really promotes the health. My coworker the other day had a really great analogy. He said it's like trimming your hair. Trimming your hair actually promotes more growth and it keeps it healthy. And that's the
Yeah.
exact same thing that happens with bamboo.
We're getting rid of split ends, right? Just
Exactly.
that preventative maintenance.
Yeah,
How
and
are
then
these?
using it, so it's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. How are these buildings, or standing up, kind of against, the traditional, kind of wood framing techniques?
Sure. So that gets into the ways that BAMCOR is changing the methods of building.
Right.
So the methodology that really underpins everything we do is called LOBIC. It stands for Load Optimized Biogenic Industrialized Construction.
All right.
And so it's a mouthful. I can kind of take it piece by piece.
Yeah.
But the load optimized really gets at the design of the prime wall. So the prime wall
Hmm.
is our main product, and it is a panelized system. So we moved away from 2x4 and 2x6 traditional stick framing to a panelized system. And there's a couple benefits of doing this. The primary one is that it creates a much tighter building envelope. So we're removing thermal bridging that results in increased efficiency. So
Right.
this gets at that operating carbon piece. We're
Yeah.
actually tackling both embodied and operating carbon. But the load bearing part of LOBIC refers to the fact that this new panelized system, you actually can't achieve it with fibers that are of the strength of traditional softwoods. That's how the timber bamboo originally came in, was because its superior strength was needed from a load bearing capacity to have these panels that then make up a wall. But a bamboo's superior strength isn't actually needed everywhere, particularly in low rise buildings, which is what the prime wall is
Right.
predominantly for. So that's where eucalyptus comes in. And we're really increasing resource efficiency by carefully optimizing which fiber to use based on the load bearing capacity needed within different parts of the building's wall.
Yeah. And when it comes to assembly, of some of these walls, or, just kind of like using some of your products in general, I would imagine it's pretty similar to working with wood. I guess specifically if they're coming in like these prepackaged pallets or something like that, then it's a little easier to stand up. But, I think a lot about the skills that have been, kind of refined over years and working with wood, and kind of they have their systems down, and kind of methodic way to, essentially construct a particular unit, right? Um, are construction workers, or, developers, actually working with, the product and manipulating it in a way, or are they really just kind of using the pallet and kind of placing?
Yeah, you hit on a couple of key things in there. So assembling and installing the prime wall is very different than stick framing.
Right.
Because we prefabricate our panels, so this gets into the industrialized construction piece of LOBIC. In our factory, we actually cut each and every panel to job-specific requirements. So
Right.
every window, every door, it's all pre-cut in our factory. And this, first off, has the benefit of reducing construction waste because there's
Yeah.
no on-site cutting. We basically
Right.
deliver a pallet, they take it off, they put it into place, they nail it in.
Right.
It's super easy. And that gets into another value prop of the prime wall is it's incredibly easy and fast to assemble. And you don't need a lot of the traditional skill set, as you alluded to, of framing in order to assemble a prime wall building.
Yeah.
And that's really important in today's world because there is a significant labor shortage in the construction industry.
Yeah.
There's a shortage of hundreds of thousands of jobs. So the easier we can make installing our system and framing buildings, it really helps open up that labor pool a lot more. And so that's another benefit and another reason why developers like working with our product.
Yeah. I love it. Thank you so much for coming on the episode, Kate. I really appreciate it. I do have one final question for you. I guess, how can we all be better?
Yes, a hard question to answer. Because the climate crisis will really require us to fundamentally change every aspect of our lives. It can be an overwhelming question to answer. But I wanted to provide an answer that I think would help listeners feel empowered, because so much is out of our control, but very much what is within our control is the way we live our lives on a day-to-day basis. And so how can we be better? I think it's by moving towards circular and regenerative ways of living. And so what this means, we have inherited very degenerative economies in which we take materials, we make them into stuff that we want, we use them for a while, often only once, and then we throw them away. And that's really pushing us over our planetary boundaries. Instead, we really need to create economies that work with and within the cycles of the living world. And so that means resources are never used up, they're used again and again. And where waste is generated, it's used as food for another process. And so what can this look like in our everyday lives? It means choosing the sun as our power source. It means choosing reusable bottles and bags instead of single-use ones. Composting food or shopping at local farms are good examples. Really, the options are endless, and the opportunity is very much in front of us.
As we wrap up this insightful conversation with Kate Chilton over at BamCore, it's evident that their innovative solutions serve as a poignant reminder. We must broaden our perspective and consider the entire value chain when evaluating the materials that we use, regardless of its application. BamCore's approach showcases how nature provides a plethora of solutions to combat climate change. And in a world grappling with environmental challenges, it's really refreshing to see companies like BamCore pioneering sustainable practices that not only benefit the planet, but also offer practical solutions for the future that lead to better business outcomes for companies. Through harnessing the inherent strength and versatility of bamboo, they're not only creating a sustainable alternative, but also open doors to a new era of eco-conscious construction. As we continue our journey towards a greener future, let's remember the lessons that nature can teach us.